The scissors glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights of the school hallway. Students crowded around, their whispers sharp and cutting. A uniformed officer stood in the center of it all, his expression cold, unflinching. In front of him, a girl sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face as he grabbed a fistful of her thick, coiled hair. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect," the officer spat, his voice echoing against the lockers. "You think you're better than everyone else because of your little speech in class? Well, let's see how proud you are now." The girl tried to move, her hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. "Please, this isn't right. You can't," but the officer's hand pushed her back down. The sound of the scissors snapping shut rang out, and strands of her hair fell to the floor like feathers. The crowd gasped, but no one stepped forward. No one dared. "Look at her now," the officer sneered. "No more attitude. No more thinking you can talk back. Maybe you'll finally learn your place." The humiliation burned hotter than the tears running down her face. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Students whispered cruelly behind their hands, others just stared, wide-eyed and horrified. Somewhere in the crowd, a teacher tried to step in. "Officer, this is unnecessary. She's just a kid," the officer spun around, his voice booming. "She broke the rules. And this school has been far too lenient with this kind of behavior. I'm doing what needs to be done." The scissors snapped again, and another chunk of her hair fell. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight back, but her legs felt bolted to the chair. All she could do was sit there as the officer's cruelty unfolded, second by second. Then the front doors slammed open. The heavy sound of footsteps pounded through the hall, each one louder than the last. Students turned to look, their eyes widening as a man in a dark suit appeared, his badge catching the light. The officer froze mid-cut, his eyes locking with the man's. "What are you doing here?" "This is a school matter." "No," the man interrupted, his voice sharp and commanding. "This is a federal matter now." The room fell silent. The tension was thick, suffocating. The officer took a step back, the scissors trembling slightly in his hand. "Step away from her," the man said, his voice low but lethal. "Now." The officer hesitated, but the authority radiating from the man was undeniable. He let the scissors drop to the floor with a metallic clatter. The girl looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief and relief, but her shame lingered. Her hair, her identity, lay scattered in pieces at her feet. "You don't understand," the officer stammered, his confidence unraveling. She was out of line. She was disrespectful. "I had to, you had to nothing," the man cut him off. "You abused your power. And now you're going to face the consequences." The crowd, once frozen, began to murmur. Phones were out, recording every second. The officer's face paled as he realized that his authority was slipping through his fingers. The girl's father stepped closer, his eyes locked on the man who had humiliated his daughter. "You picked the wrong person to mess with," he said, his voice trembling with controlled fury. "You think you're untouchable. You're about to find out how wrong you are." The officer's mouth opened to protest, but no words came out. He took a step back as the man pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Within moments, more agents appeared at the door, their presence heavy and unyielding. The students watched, their eyes wide with disbelief as the officer who had just been cutting the girl's hair was now being handcuffed. The whispers grew louder. Some looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Others stared, their faces filled with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. But the girl wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her father, her protector, the man who had shown up in her darkest moment. Her heart still pounded with fear, but there was something else now. Something stronger. Hope. And yet, as the officer was led away, his face red and his voice trembling with protests, there was a lingering question in the air. How far would her father go to make sure justice was served? And what would happen to the officer now that the tables had turned? No one could have predicted what came next. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all forms. This story is a powerful reminder of resilience, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. To every Black viewer watching this, know that your voice matters, your identity is powerful, and your story deserves to be heard. Thank you for being here with us. Enjoy the story, and if you find it impactful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives. Now, let's dive into today's story. The morning sunlight streamed through the half-open blinds of the modest kitchen. Plates clinked softly as scrambled eggs sizzled in a pan, and the smell of toast filled the air. Ava Brooks sat at the table, her elbows resting on the smooth surface as she flipped through her notebook. Her pen tapped rhythmically against the lined paper, but her eyes weren't focused on the words she had written. She was rehearsing. Mentally running through every line, every pause, every emphasis she planned to deliver that afternoon in front of the entire school. Today was supposed to be her moment. Her father, Malcolm Brooks, stood by the stove, his sharp eyes scanning the morning news on his tablet while keeping an absent-minded hand on the spatula. He wasn't just any father. Malcolm was the assistant director of the FBI, a man who had built his career on sharp instincts, discipline, and an unwavering sense of justice. But at home, he tried to soften the hard edges of his job, especially for Ava. She had inherited his determination, his sharp mind, and, most importantly, his refusal to back down. "You're too quiet this morning," Malcolm said without looking up. "That's not like you." Ava glanced up from her notebook and tried to smile, but it faltered. "Just nervous, I guess. The whole school's going to be there. What if I mess up?" "You won't," he said, setting the spatula down and turning to face her. His expression softened. "You've practiced this 100 times. Besides, no one in that audience knows more about this topic than you do. Own it." Ava nodded, trying to absorb his confidence, but her stomach still twisted in knots. She wasn't just giving any speech. Her topic was about racial identity and systemic injustice, issues she cared about deeply but also ones she knew made people uncomfortable. The school had given her the platform, but not everyone was happy about it. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. A text popped up from her best friend, Maya. "Good luck today. Don't let them scare you." She appreciated Maya's encouragement, but Ava knew not everyone felt the same way. She had overheard the whispers in the hallways, seen the side eyes from certain teachers, and, most noticeably, felt the tension whenever Officer Grant was around. Officer Derek Grant had been assigned to the school as a resource officer just a few months ago. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of authority that demanded attention. But it wasn't just his presence that made people uneasy, it was his attitude. He seemed to single out certain students, always the ones who looked different, spoke up, or didn't fit the mold he expected. Ava had crossed paths with him more than once. He didn't like how she asked questions. How she pushed back. He had already warned her once about her attitude, after she challenged him during a class discussion about law enforcement practices. That tension had only grown, and Ava couldn't shake the feeling that today would be no different. The school parking lot was already full when Ava and Malcolm pulled in. She could see groups of students milling around, some holding signs and banners in support of her presentation. Others just watched, their expressions guarded. Malcolm parked the car and turned to her. "Call me if anything happens," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. "I'll be fine," Ava replied, forcing a smile she didn't quite feel. But as she walked through the front doors, her heart pounded. The auditorium was packed. Rows of chairs were filled with students, teachers, and even a few parents who had come to watch. She spotted Maya near the front, giving her a thumbs up, and tried to focus on that instead of the weight pressing down on her chest. The principal gave a short introduction before stepping aside and gesturing for Ava to take the stage. She gripped the edges of the podium, feeling her palms sweat as the microphone hummed. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the fluttering panic inside her. "Today, I want to talk about identity, how it shapes us, how it defines us, and how it's often challenged in ways we don't expect." She glanced at the crowd, catching glimpses of nods and a few crossed arms. She pressed forward. But identity isn't just personal. It's political. It's historical. And sometimes, it's weaponized against us. The murmurs began almost immediately, but Ava didn't stop. She pushed through, laying out examples, statistics, and personal anecdotes that painted a clear picture of racial injustice. By the time she finished, the room was buzzing. Some students clapped. Others remained stiff and silent. And then Officer Grant stood up. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You think you're oppressed? That you're some kind of victim? Let me tell you something, young lady, you don't know the first thing about real struggles." Ava froze as the murmurs turned into gasps. Grant stalked toward her, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "This kind of talk divides people," he said, his eyes narrowing. "And you're not going to do that in my school." Ava's pulse raced. "I have the right to speak, not anymore." Before she could react, Grant grabbed her by the arm and marched her toward the back of the stage. Students pulled out their phones, recording every step. Ava's voice cracked as she tried to protest, but Grant wasn't listening. In the hallway, the confrontation escalated. "You think you can just say whatever you want without consequences?" Grant snarled. "You need to be put in your place." Ava's breath hitched. "You can't do this. You're out of line." He yanked a pair of scissors from a drawer and held them up. "No, you're out of line. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The cold metal touched her scalp, and Ava's world spun. Students gathered at the doorway, their faces pale as they watched. Some yelled for help, but no one stepped in. And then the front doors burst open. The silence that followed the slamming of the doors felt heavier than the air itself. Officer Grant's grip on the scissors loosened, but his hand lingered near them, trembling slightly as his eyes darted toward the man now standing at the entrance of the hallway. Malcolm Brooks didn't speak right away. His sharp, commanding presence filled the space without a word, and for a moment, it was as though time had stopped. Ava felt her breath catch as her father's eyes locked onto her, taking in the strands of hair scattered across the floor and the fear still frozen on her face. Her stomach churned. She wanted to run to him, to let him fix this, to make it stop, but something in the way he stood there, rigid, controlled, yet simmering beneath the surface, made her stay where she was. Grant's voice broke the silence first. "You can't just barge in here like this," he said, his tone forced and defensive. "This is a school matter, not a federal." Malcolm raised a hand, and Grant's words died mid-sentence. "Let her go." Ava felt Grant's fingers twitch before he finally released her arm. She stumbled back a step, her legs unsteady, but she didn't fall. Malcolm's eyes never left Grant. "I don't know what you think you're doing here," Grant said, trying to sound firm, but the waver in his voice betrayed him. "This girl has been out of control. She's been causing disruptions, stirring up division, and disrespecting authority. Someone had to humiliate her." Malcolm's voice cut through Grant's excuses like a blade. "Someone had to make an example out of her. By assaulting her. By cutting her hair." Grant straightened his back. "You don't understand what's been happening in this school. The tension she's causing, the only tension in this hallway is the one you created," Malcolm snapped. His words carried a weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. "You put your hands on a child. You violated her rights. And you did it because you thought no one would stop you." Grant's face turned red, and his hand instinctively rested on the radio clip to his shoulder. I did what I had to do to maintain order. You abused your power, Malcolm interrupted, stepping closer. And now you're going to answer for it. The crowd of students that had gathered outside the door had grown larger, their phones held high, recording every moment. Ava could feel their stares burning into her, but she couldn't move. Her heart was pounding, her breath shallow. She wanted to believe that her father's presence was enough to fix everything, but the look in Grant's eyes told her otherwise. Grant stepped back, but his jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "You think you can walk in here and just take over? I've been enforcing the rules in this school since before you ever." "This isn't about rules," Malcolm interrupted again, his voice cold and sharp. "This is about your ego. Your racism. Your abuse of power." He gestured to the students in the hallway. "You thought no one would stop you because you thought no one could. But you were wrong." Grant's eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to Malcolm. His breathing quickened. "You don't scare me." "You should be scared," Malcolm said. "Not of me, but of what comes next." Ava's stomach twisted at those words. There was something in her father's tone that she hadn't heard before. It wasn't just anger. It was finality. Grant's radio crackled, breaking the tension for a brief moment, and he reached for it out of habit. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice dropping low enough that only Grant could hear. "If you think this ends here, you're wrong." Grant's hand froze, and Ava saw the first flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then he clenched his jaw and straightened his shoulders. "You don't have jurisdiction here," he said through gritted teeth. "This is a school matter." "Not anymore," Malcolm replied, stepping back and pulling out his phone. He dialed a number, his eyes never leaving Grant's. "I'm requesting immediate backup. I need agents on site for detainment and investigation." Grant's face paled. "You can't." "I can," Malcolm said, cutting him off. "And I will." The tension in the room thickened as students whispered and phones captured every word. Ava's heart pounded as she watched Grant's confidence crack, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. She wanted more. She wanted him to feel the weight of everything he had done, the shame he had tried to force on her. Grant's voice dropped, and he stepped closer to Malcolm. "You really think this is going to end well for you? You really think you can make this about race and walk away clean?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "This isn't about race." He glanced at Ava, then back at Grant. "This is about consequences." Grant's hand hovered near his belt, but Malcolm didn't move. The hallway felt suffocating as the two men stood inches apart, neither backing down. Then the sound of sirens pierced the air. Grant's face fell. Ava swallowed hard, her eyes darting between her father and the officer who had just tried to destroy her. She could feel the energy shift as the weight of what was about to happen started sinking in. Grant took a step back, his hands trembling slightly as the first wave of agents entered the building. Malcolm didn't move. He just watched as the world around Grant began to close in. And yet, despite the sirens, the agents, and the cameras recording every moment, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. Something was still coming, something bigger, something that would shatter everything Grant thought he knew. She could feel it building, like the sharp intake of breath before a scream. The air in the hallway was thick, heavy with tension that seemed to vibrate off the walls. Every sound, the shuffling of feet, the whispers spreading through the growing crowd, the sharp clink of metal handcuffs snapping shut, felt amplified. Officer Grant stood frozen, his hands trembling ever so slightly as his wrists were locked together. The two FBI agents flanking him exuded authority, their uniforms crisp and their expressions unreadable. But Grant wasn't focused on them. His eyes darted to Malcolm Brooks, who stood just a few feet away, shoulders squared, unyielding, and radiating the kind of power that made rooms go silent. Malcolm's stare didn't waver, and his voice cut through the charged atmosphere like a blade. "You thought no one would stop you, didn't you? You thought you could do whatever you wanted to whoever you wanted without consequences. His words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They carried the weight of authority, of justice, and of something far more personal, outrage. Grant opened his mouth to respond, but Malcolm raised his hand, silencing him before a single syllable could escape. No more excuses. No more lies. No more hiding behind that badge. Grant's shoulders tensed, his jaw tightening as though he was trying to hold himself together. I was doing my job, he said, but the confidence that once filled his voice was gone. She was out of control. Disrespectful. Someone had to step in, step in. Malcolm snapped, stepping closer, his towering frame making Grant instinctively lean back. You didn't step in. You crossed the line. You humiliated a child in front of her peers. You tried to break her. Grant flinched, but his voice rose defensively. She needed to be put in her place. Someone had to stop her from spreading hate and division. Malcolm's eyes burned as he took another step forward. Hate. Division. He gestured toward the students gathered in the hall, their phones raised, capturing every moment. Look at them. Look at her. He pointed to Ava, standing behind him, her face pale but her eyes steady, locked on Grant. Does she look like the one spreading hate? Or do you? Grant's eyes flickered with something close to panic, but he tried to keep his footing. You don't understand the pressure in this school, he said, his words coming out fast, almost stumbling over each other. The rules are falling apart. Kids like her think they can do whatever they want, say whatever they want, kids like her. Malcolm's voice sharpened, cutting through the noise of the hallway like a blade. You mean black kids? Kids who stand up for themselves. Who refuse to stay silent when people like you try to push them down. Grant's face flushed red, his lips tightening, but before he could speak, Malcolm pressed on. You didn't do this to enforce rules. You did this to send a message. And now I'm sending one right back. The crowd shifted, their murmurs growing louder as the agent stepped in closer, their hands steady but firm on Grant's arms. Malcolm's voice dropped, low enough that only Grant could hear. You thought no one could touch you. That you were untouchable. But you forgot one thing, you crossed the wrong person. Grant's breath hitched, and his eyes darted toward the agents, who were now reaching for their radios. He tried to pull back, but Malcolm leaned in, his voice calm but lethal. Don't fight it, he said. It's over. No, Grant hissed, his voice trembling now. This isn't over. You can't just come in here and tear me down. I've given years to this job. I've earned this position. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. You didn't earn it. You abused it. Grant's hands clenched into fists, but the agents didn't give him room to move. One of them began reading him his rights, but Grant's focus stayed locked on Malcolm. You're going to regret this, he said, his voice low and sharp. You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made, Malcolm said, his voice steady, was not stopping you sooner. The crowd surged closer, phones held high, recording every word. Students whispered, some in shock, others in disbelief. Ava stood at the edge of it all, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she watched the man who had humiliated her just minutes ago now standing there with his hands cuffed. But as much as the scene should have brought relief, it didn't feel like enough. Grant's voice broke through the noise again. You think this ends with me, he spat. You think this school doesn't back me? These parents? These teachers? They'll stand with me. They'll fight for me. Ava's heart twisted, but Malcolm didn't flinch. Let them, he said. Because after today, everyone will know exactly who you are. And so will they. Grant's breath quickened. You don't scare me, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Malcolm leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. You should be scared, not of me, but of what's coming next. Grant opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the agents began leading him down the hallway. The sound of his boots scraping against the floor echoed as the crowd parted, their eyes following him like shadows. Some whispered. Others stared in silence. Ava's gaze didn't leave him until he disappeared through the doors. Malcolm turned then, his eyes softening as they met Ava's. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're okay now," he said. "It's over." But Ava shook her head. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Ava swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "He's not the only one," she said. "The teachers. The staff. Everyone who let this happen, they're still here. And they're still letting it happen." Malcolm's expression darkened, but he nodded slowly. "Then we'll deal with them too." For the first time, Ava felt the tension in her chest ease, but only slightly. As the hallway slowly emptied and the agents disappeared, her eyes lingered on the spot where Grant had stood. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face what came next. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the sound of footsteps and murmurs echoing against the walls. The weight of everything that had just unfolded lingered like a storm that hadn't yet passed. Ava stood near the edge of the crowd, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her hands clenched at her sides as if letting go of that tension would make her collapse. Malcolm Brooks stood beside her, his presence steady but sharp, the kind of steadiness that didn't calm but instead braced for impact. Every word that had been spoken moments ago still hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, yet there was a sense that it wasn't enough. Ava's eyes were locked on the empty spot where Officer Grant had stood, his wrists bound by cuffs, his protests swallowed by the echo of agents moving him down the hall. The image played over and over in her mind, his face twisted with fear and desperation, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. But instead of relief, Ava felt a knot in her chest that refused to loosen. Her heart pounded against her ribs, loud enough that it drowned out the sounds of the crowd. Malcolm's voice broke through the noise, low but firm, each word carefully measured. "It's over," he said, though his tone didn't carry the finality she needed. It felt like a placeholder, a temporary fix for something that was far from resolved. Ava's head shook almost immediately, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. "No, it's not." Malcolm turned toward her, his sharp eyes scanning her face for answers she wasn't sure how to give. "What do you mean it's not?" His voice softened slightly, but there was still an edge to it, the protective tone of someone who had been fighting battles for far too long. Ava swallowed hard, her voice trembling despite the anger boiling inside her. "Because it wasn't just him," she said, her words picking up speed as if they had been waiting to spill out. "It was never just him. Everyone saw what he was doing. The teachers. The principal. They let it happen." Malcolm's expression darkened, the muscles in his jaw tightening as she spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to calm her down. He just listened. "They knew," Ava continued, her voice rising. "They saw him harassing people in the halls. They saw him targeting students, humiliating them, and they looked the other way. Or worse, they defended him. They told us to respect him. They told us to follow the rules and stop causing problems. They let him do this." Malcolm's hand rested gently on her shoulder, but Ava barely felt it. The words kept pouring out, the anger bubbling to the surface faster than she could contain it. "And when I spoke up, they acted like I was the problem. Like I was the one making things worse just because I wouldn't stay quiet. And now he's gone, but they're still here. They're still letting it happen, and no one's going to stop them." Malcolm's voice was low but steady, grounding her just enough to keep her from unraveling completely. "We will stop them," he said, the conviction in his tone cutting through her panic. "Not just him. All of them." Before Ava could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted. Principal Hastings appeared, his face pale and drawn, beads of sweat visible along his hairline. He straightened his tie as he approached, but his movements were jittery, like someone trying to outrun the inevitable. "Mr. Brooks," Hastings began, his voice thin and forced. "We need to talk about what just happened. This situation is complicated." Malcolm's eyes narrowed as he turned to face him. "The situation," he said sharply, "is already being handled. Or did you not see Officer Grant being led out of here in cuffs?" Hastings swallowed, his eyes flicking nervously toward Ava and then back to Malcolm. "Yes, of course, but there are protocols we need to follow." "Procedures, protocols?" Malcolm's voice sliced through the principal's attempt at control. "You're talking about protocols now? After you let that man terrorize students in your school for months? After you let this happen to my daughter?" Hastings held up his hands, palms out, as if trying to deflect the accusations. "No one wanted this to happen. But we can't just rush into accusations. The school's reputation, the school's reputation." Ava's voice broke through before Malcolm could respond, her words trembling but sharp. "That's what you're worried about?" Hastings flinched as Ava stepped forward, her voice rising with each word. "Do you know what it felt like to sit there while he cut my hair in front of everyone? While he made me feel like I was nothing? Do you know what it feels like to be treated like you don't belong? Like you're the problem just because you exist?" The principal's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ava's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "You knew what he was doing," she said, her words trembling with rage. "You saw it, and you let it happen. You defended him. You let him use his badge as a weapon, and now you want to protect the school's reputation." Malcolm stepped in then, his voice sharp and unyielding. "She's right. You knew. And now you're going to answer for it. You and everyone else who let this go on." Hastings took a step back, his voice faltering. This isn't what it looks like. We didn't know it had gotten this bad." Malcolm didn't let him finish. "You knew," he said again, his voice lower this time but no less lethal. "And there's already an investigation. Not just into Grant, but into this entire administration. Every ignored report. Every student who felt unsafe. Every excuse you made to protect him." Hastings' eyes widened, his voice cracking. "You can't," Malcolm's voice cut him off. "I already did." The principal swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he took another step back. "I need to call the school board." Malcolm didn't stop him, but his eyes stayed locked on the man until he disappeared around the corner. Ava's chest heaved, her heart pounding as the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter but still trembling. Malcolm looked at her, his gaze steady but heavy. "We keep going," he said. "We make sure no one ever goes through this again." Ava nodded, but her thoughts were already racing. There were more people like Grant out there. She had seen it, lived it. But now, for the first time, she wasn't afraid to fight back. The hallway had emptied out, but the tension that filled the space refused to dissipate. Ava stood near the edge of the room, her hands still trembling despite the weight that had lifted when Officer Grant was taken away. She didn't feel relieved, not yet. Her thoughts spiraled, tangled with questions that wouldn't leave her alone. She could still see the looks on the faces of the students who had stood there, frozen, as Grant humiliated her. Some had held up their phones, recording every moment, but none of them had stepped in to stop it. That was what stayed with her, the silence. The kind of silence that made you feel invisible. Malcolm stayed close, his presence steady even as his eyes swept the room, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Ava could feel it. He wasn't done. Neither of them were. The fight wasn't over, and that realization weighed on her. She didn't want it to be over, not yet, not when so many people had let this happen. Principal Hastings returned, his steps hesitant, his shoulders hunched like a man walking toward his own execution. He didn't look at Ava, not directly. Instead, he addressed Malcolm, his voice thin and brittle. "I've spoken with the school board," Hastings began, though the nervous quiver in his voice betrayed him. "They're concerned about the optics of all this. We need to manage the narrative carefully." Malcolm's eyes snapped up, and Hastings's words faltered mid-sentence. "The narrative?" Malcolm's voice was sharp, cutting through the principal's excuses before he could finish. "You think this is about managing optics? This is about accountability. You allowed this to happen under your watch, and now you're worried about appearances." Hastings swallowed hard. "I'm not trying to make excuses. But you have to understand, there's going to be fallout. The media's already outside. Parents are calling non-stop, demanding answers. If we don't control this, you don't control anything anymore," Malcolm interrupted, stepping closer, his voice low but firm. "Not after today. Your first concern should have been the safety of these students, not your reputation. And the fact that it wasn't is exactly why this investigation won't stop with Grant." Hastings's face paled further. "Investigation? You can't seriously. I already have agents reviewing records," Malcolm said without hesitation. "Complaints filed, disciplinary actions ignored, reports swept under the rug. This isn't just about Grant. It's about a culture that let him operate unchecked. That let him believe he could get away with this. And the more you try to deflect, the worse it's going to look for you." Ava watched Hastings's shoulders sag as the weight of those words hit him. But she didn't feel sympathy. Not even a little. "What happens to the teachers who supported him?" Ava's voice broke through the tension, sharp and direct. "The ones who turned their backs or made excuses. Do they get to stay? Do they get to pretend like they didn't know what he was doing?" Malcolm turned toward her, his expression softening slightly, but Ava wasn't finished. "I don't want this to just disappear," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I don't want them to walk away and pretend like it never happened. Because if they do, nothing's going to change." Hastings opened his mouth as if to respond, but Malcolm cut him off again. "It's not going to disappear," he said, looking directly at Ava. "I'll make sure of that." Hastings took another step back, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I need time to figure out how to handle this." "You've already had time," Malcolm snapped. "Too much time. And you wasted it." Ava stepped closer, her voice rising. "You didn't protect us. You protected him. And now you're worried about protecting yourself. But what about the students he hurt? What about the ones who didn't have anyone to stand up for them?" Hastings finally looked at her, his face crumpling as if the weight of her words was physically pressing down on him. But Ava wasn't done. "Do you even know what it feels like to sit there and have someone strip away your dignity? To feel powerless while everyone watches and does nothing? I'm not the only one he's done this to. And you let it happen." Malcolm's voice followed hers, sharp and cold. "And now you're going to answer for it." Hastings's shoulders slumped. "What do you want me to do?" "You're going to cooperate with the investigation," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "You're going to turn over every file, every report, and every email. And you're going to start preparing for the fact that when this is over, you might not have a job anymore." Hastings's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked defeated, and for the first time, Ava saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of someone who knew the walls were closing in. As Hastings turned and walked away, Malcolm stepped closer to Ava. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Ava shook her head. "No. But I will be." Malcolm nodded, but Ava could see the tension still lingering in his eyes. He wasn't done. Neither was she. The sound of footsteps brought them both back to the moment. Maya appeared, her face pale but determined. She didn't say anything. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Ava, holding her tight. Ava felt her shoulders drop, the weight of the moment settling as Maya's presence reminded her she wasn't alone. "They're not going to get away with this," Maya said quietly. Ava nodded. "Not this time." Malcolm watched them, his eyes sharp but soft at the edges. He reached for his phone, stepping away as he began making calls, his voice low and deliberate. Ava knew what he was doing, setting things in motion, ensuring that no one could sweep this under the rug. But as she looked around the empty hallway, Ava's thoughts wouldn't stop racing. She thought about the students who hadn't spoken up. The ones who had looked away. The ones who had cheered Grant on when he humiliated others. This wasn't just about him, or Hastings, or even the teachers who had let it happen. It was about everyone who had stayed silent. Ava's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't fear. It was determination. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The echoes of Principal Hastings' hurried footsteps faded into the distance, leaving behind an almost eerie stillness in the hallway. Ava's pulse hadn't slowed. Her hands still felt clammy, and the weight in her chest hadn't lifted. Malcolm stood nearby, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and sharp as he gave instructions that sounded more like orders. She could see the tension in his posture, the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders squared as if he were bracing for impact. Ava wasn't sure if it was comforting or unsettling. Maybe both. Maya lingered beside her, her presence grounding Ava in ways words couldn't. But even with Maya close, Ava felt the heaviness of what had happened pressing down on her, threatening to swallow her whole. Her eyes drifted back to the spot where Officer Grant had stood, his defiance crumbling the moment those handcuffs clicked around his wrists. It felt satisfying at first, but now it felt hollow. Maya's voice broke through the haze. "You should sit down." Ava shook her head, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. "I don't want to sit. I can't sit." Maya softened. "You're shaking." Ava glanced at her hands and realized Maya was right. Her fingers trembled as if her body still hadn't caught up to the moment. She clenched them into fists, trying to force the trembling to stop. "I'm fine," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. Maya didn't push. Instead, she stayed close, her voice steady. "You don't have to be fine. Not right now." Ava's breath hitched, and she turned away, her eyes burning. "I just keep thinking about how everyone watched," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They saw what he was doing, and they didn't do anything. Not one of them." Maya stepped closer, her words careful. "They were scared, Ava. Just like you were." Ava's voice cracked. "But I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. And the worst part? For a second, I thought he was right. I thought maybe I did deserve it." Maya's voice sharpened. "Don't you dare say that. Don't you let him win." Ava's shoulders shook as she exhaled, and Maya stepped in front of her, forcing Ava to meet her eyes. "You didn't deserve any of this. And you didn't let it happen. He did. And so did everyone who let him think he could get away with it." Malcolm's voice cut through the conversation as he ended his call and stepped toward them. "They won't get away with it," he said, his tone steady but heavy. "The investigation's already started. Grant's going to face charges, and the school's going to answer for every report they ignored." Ava looked up at him, her voice unsteady. "What if it's not enough? What if nothing changes?" Malcolm's expression softened, but there was still fire behind his eyes. "It will. It has to." Ava's stomach twisted. She wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. She thought about all the times Grant had looked at her like she was less than human, like he had every right to put her in her place, and how no one had stopped him. What if there were more like him? What if this was just the beginning? Malcolm seemed to read the thoughts swirling in her mind because his voice softened. "I know you're scared," he said. "I know you're angry. You should be. But this doesn't end with him. It doesn't end today. Ava swallowed hard, her voice breaking. I just want to feel safe. Malcolm's face fell, and for the first time, Ava saw the crack in his armor. It was subtle, the flicker in his eyes, the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke. You will, he said, but it didn't feel like a promise. It felt like a hope. The sound of voices down the hall pulled them back to the moment. Teachers were gathering now, murmuring among themselves, their eyes darting toward Ava and then quickly away. Malcolm turned, his presence enough to make them scatter like shadows. Maya leaned in closer. They're scared of you. Ava's lips pressed into a thin line. Good. Malcolm glanced back at her, his voice low. This isn't over yet, Ava. You know that, right? She nodded, her voice steadier this time. I know. The sound of footsteps grew louder again, and Ava's eyes snapped toward the end of the hall. A group of agents had returned, their expressions grim. One of them approached Malcolm and spoke quietly, but Ava caught fragments of the conversation. Reports are pouring in, multiple complaints, documentation, possible negligence charges. Malcolm's expression hardened, but he nodded. Make sure nothing's buried. The agent gave a sharp nod and disappeared down the hall, leaving Malcolm standing there, his shoulders tense. Ava stepped closer. What happens now? Malcolm's eyes met hers. Now we make sure every single person who let this happen answers for it. Ava's heart pounded. She wanted to believe it was that simple, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't be. The people who had let this happen weren't going to go down without a fight. But neither was she. Maya touched her arm. Whatever happens, you're not doing this alone. Ava nodded, her voice firm despite the trembling in her chest. I know. Malcolm's phone buzzed again, and he stepped away to take the call, his voice sharp as he gave orders. Ava looked around the hallway, taking in the faces of the teachers and students still lingering, their eyes filled with curiosity and unease. She saw the way they looked at her, some with guilt, others with relief that they hadn't been the ones in her position. Her hands clenched again, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was determination. Maya's voice was soft but steady. You're not done, are you? Ava shook her head, her voice steady. Not even close. The hallway felt colder now, even as the buzz of voices grew louder. Ava's eyes flicked toward the far end where teachers clustered in small groups, their whispers sharp and hurried. Some glanced toward her, then quickly looked away as if eye contact might somehow pull them into the storm brewing around her. She stood still, her heart pounding, her thoughts racing faster than she could catch them. Malcolm was still on his phone, pacing just a few feet away, his words clipped and deliberate. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight he carried with every decision he made, but it wasn't enough to calm the knot in her stomach. Maya stayed close, her presence grounding Ava, but even that didn't stop the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Anger, frustration, and something deeper, fear. Not fear of Grant anymore, but fear of what came next. What if this didn't fix anything? What if the people who had stood by and let it happen found a way to slip through the cracks? Ava clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let that happen. Malcolm hung up and turned toward her, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. She could feel the weight of his gaze, and it only made her pulse quicken. He didn't speak right away, and the silence between them stretched until it felt suffocating. Finally, he stepped closer. I need you to be ready for what comes next, he said, his voice low but firm. Ava swallowed hard. I'm ready. Malcolm's eyes softened for just a moment, but it passed quickly. This isn't over, he said. The investigation's moving fast, but it's going to get messy. People are going to start pointing fingers. They're going to try to protect themselves, even if it means throwing someone else under the bus. Ava's stomach twisted. What if they come after me? Malcolm didn't flinch. They won't. Not while I'm here. She wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered at the edges of her thoughts. And what about the others? The teachers who defended him? The ones who looked the other way? They're already being questioned, Malcolm said. And if they had any part in what happened, they'll face consequences. Ava shook her head. That's not enough. Consequences don't fix what they did. It doesn't change the fact that they let this happen. Malcolm's voice dropped, heavy and steady. No, it doesn't. But it's a start. Before Ava could respond, another voice cut through the noise. You think this fixes everything? They turned to see Mrs. Reynolds, one of Ava's teachers, standing a few feet away. Her arms were crossed, but her face betrayed the nerve she was trying to hide. Ava's chest tightened. What's that supposed to mean? Mrs. Reynolds's voice hardened. You think tearing this school apart is going to make things better? You think dragging everyone through the mud is going to fix what happened to you? Malcolm stepped forward, his voice sharp. Are you seriously trying to blame her for this? Mrs. Reynolds flinched but didn't back down. I'm saying this school isn't perfect. But what happened today didn't start with Grant, and it's not going to end with him either. And maybe instead of trying to burn everything down, you should be thinking about what comes after. Ava's voice cracked as she stepped forward. What comes after? What comes after is kids feeling safe. What comes after is people like you not turning your backs when something's wrong. Mrs. Reynolds's voice wavered. It's not that simple. It is that simple, Ava snapped. You saw what he was doing. You saw how he treated people, and you didn't do anything. And now you're worried about the school instead of the people he hurt. Malcolm's voice cut in before Mrs. Reynolds could respond. You're done here. Mrs. Reynolds faltered, her face flushing red as Malcolm stepped closer. You're part of the problem, he said, his voice steady but sharp. And if you can't see that, you don't belong here. She turned quickly, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she disappeared around the corner. Ava's hands were still shaking, but this time it wasn't fear, it was rage. Malcolm turned back to her, his voice softer now. I know this doesn't feel like enough, he said. But we're not finished. Ava's eyes burned, but she nodded. I know. And I'm not finished either. Maya stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. You don't have to do this alone. Ava's breath hitched, and for the first time, her shoulders relaxed just slightly. I know, she said again, but this time it felt more certain. The sound of more footsteps filled the hall, and Ava turned to see the agents returning, their faces serious. Malcolm stepped forward, speaking quietly with them while Ava and Maya stood back, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of them. Maya's voice broke the silence. Does it feel real yet? Ava exhaled slowly. No. But maybe it doesn't have to. Not yet. The agents disappeared down the hall, and Malcolm turned back toward her. Come on, he said. We're not done. Ava followed him, her steps heavier now but her head held high. She could feel the weight of every moment pressing down on her, but it didn't feel unbearable. It felt like fuel. Every whispered conversation, every glance from the teachers, every uncertain look from the students reminded her why this couldn't end here. She didn't look back as they stepped out of the hallway and into the next battle. She didn't need to. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, parents, students, and members of the community who had followed the case since the day Officer Grant was taken away in handcuffs. The weight of the room pressed down on Ava's chest, but this time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like fuel. She sat beside her father, Malcolm, who looked as composed as ever, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of emotion behind his eyes. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about every student who had felt invisible, every voice that had been silenced, and every moment she had questioned whether speaking up was worth it. Grant sat across the room, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his face pale and expressionless. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something hollow and broken. Ava didn't feel sorry for him. Not after what he had done. Not after the stories that came out during the investigation, stories from students who had been targeted, belittled, and humiliated, their voices finally heard after years of being ignored. The evidence had piled up quickly, and with it, the facade Grant had built crumbled piece by piece. The judge's voice cut through the murmurs, calling for order before delivering the final verdict. Guilty. On multiple counts. The words rang out, final and undeniable, and for the first time since that day in the hallway, Ava let herself exhale. She didn't smile. Not yet. But the weight that had pressed down on her for so long finally began to lift. Grant's eyes flicked toward her as he was escorted out of the courtroom, but there was no fight left in them. No anger, no defiance, only the hollow recognition that he had lost everything. Ava didn't look away. She wanted him to see her standing there, unbroken. Malcolm placed a hand on her shoulder as the crowd began to disperse, his voice low but steady. "It's done." Ava nodded, but she knew this was only the beginning. The investigation had uncovered more than anyone expected, teachers who had turned a blind eye, administrators who had buried complaints, and patterns of discrimination that ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Principal Hastings had resigned before the hearings even started, his name forever tied to the scandal, and several teachers faced disciplinary action. Some were fired. Others were reassigned. But the damage they had caused wouldn't disappear overnight. Maya met Ava outside the courthouse, her eyes shining with pride in something else, relief. She didn't speak at first. She just pulled Ava into a tight hug, and for the first time in weeks, Ava let herself lean into it. "You did it," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ava pulled back, shaking her head. "We did it." The months that followed were a whirlwind. Ava's story spread far beyond their small town, sparking protests, petitions, and policy changes. Schools across the district implemented new training programs, stricter oversight, and stronger protections for students. Ava found herself at the center of it all, interviews, speeches, meetings with lawmakers. At first, it felt overwhelming, but as time passed, it started to feel like purpose. Grant's sentencing was harsh, as it should have been. Assault. Harassment. Abuse of power. He would spend years behind bars, and when he got out, he would never wear a badge again. But Ava didn't spend much time thinking about him. She focused on what came next, on making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. Principal Hastings faded into obscurity, his career shattered. Rumors swirled that he had tried to get a job in another district, but no one wanted his name tied to their school. Ava didn't feel sorry for him either. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. Maya stayed by her side through it all, reminding Ava when to breathe and when to fight. She had been there when Ava felt like she was drowning, and she was still there now, helping her navigate what came next. And Malcolm, he became more than just her father. He became her ally, her advocate, and her biggest supporter. He had always believed in justice, but this time it was personal, and he fought for it like his life depended on it. Ava knew she wouldn't have made it through any of this without him. Standing in front of a packed auditorium months later, Ava took a deep breath and faced the crowd. Students, parents, and teachers filled the room, their eyes fixed on her. She had been afraid to speak up once. Not anymore. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she began. "It doesn't happen because one person stands up and speaks out. It happens when we refuse to stay silent. When we refuse to look away. When we decide that enough is enough." The crowd hung on her words, and for the first time, Ava felt like she belonged there. She wasn't the scared girl in the chair anymore. She was something else, stronger, braver, louder. After the applause died down, Ava looked out at the faces staring back at her, and she wondered how many of them had stayed silent before. How many had looked away? And how many would think twice about doing it again? This story isn't just about Ava. It's about all of us. About what happens when we let fear and complacency keep us from standing up for what's right. It's about the damage silence can cause and the power of speaking out. How many times have we seen something wrong and told ourselves it wasn't our place to step in? How many times have we let someone else's voice be drowned out because it was easier to stay quiet? But silence isn't neutral. It's a choice. And in the end, it's the people who speak up, the ones who refuse to be silent, who make the difference. So what would you do if you saw injustice unfolding right in front of you? Would you be the one to step in or the one to look away? Think about that the next time you see someone being treated unfairly. Think about what it means to be a bystander. And then ask yourself if you're willing to live with that choice. If this story moved you, if it made you think, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you would have done in Ava's shoes or what you think should have happened next. And if you want more stories that make you question, feel, and think, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.